Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, morning, wherever you're signing in from. If you let us know in the chat where you're joining us from, that would be really awesome. Here with Shareil and Harrison, and we'll get into this in just a couple of minutes. We'll let people filter in, but let us know in the chat where you're from, if there's any specific questions that you have, or any things that you would like to see. Hey Gary, let us know. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But yeah, excited that you're all here. Thanks for spending some time with us. Hey, Chrissy. Hey, Chris. Nice.
Oh, we got a nice international bunch.
Yeah, it's always interesting, especially as we change the times of day that we run these, where folks are joining from. India, wow. Poland.
Columbus, Ohio. My parents live there. Hi, Stephen.
Hey, Felicity.
There hasn't been a repeat one yet. This is interesting.
Yeah, very cool. All right, we'll give folks one more minute, and then we'll dive in. We're gonna go for probably 40-45 minutes ish, and then we'll have some time for questions. If you have questions throughout, let us know as well, and we'll sort of get to them as we, if they fit in with things that we have planned, we'll get to them sort of as we go. Otherwise, we'll have that time at the end as well. Hey, Casey. All right, we say we kick this off. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. We're here today to talk about how to proactively drive retention in a downturn. Really excited for this one. We're joined by Harrison from Driveway, and we have Shareil here as well from the Arrows team. But let's get into what we're going to actually sort of get in and cover in this session. So we have some really quick intros. I won't spend too much time there. Why retention is a lagging indicator. We were just chatting before we went live about how big of a factor this is and some reasons why that's the case. How to run a churn pre-mortem, onboarding implementation and training frameworks, and then how to apply those frameworks to people, process, and tools to do what we're all here to try to do, drive proactive retention. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end. After this, we'll be sending out the recording, of course, along with a step-by-step guide to product walkthroughs, set a template for higher touch customers in onboarding. That'll be with an Arrows template, and then sort of a scorecard for evaluating your current experience, sort of really getting into that churn pre-mortem that we're going to talk about. But let's dive right into some really quick intros. So I'm Stuart Balcom. I run growth here at Arrows. Arrows is a collaborative onboarding tool built specifically for HubSpot. So if you're looking for something to help onboarding, go check that out at arrows.to. But enough about me. I'm super excited to be joined by Harrison Johnson, who is the co-CEO and one of the co-founders at Driveway. Hey, Harrison, great to have you here.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me.
And as always, or as most of the time, we have Shareil Nariman, head of customer success at Arrows. He's going to be sharing his experience here as well today. Hey, Shareil.
Howdy. Good to be here. Good to see you too, Harrison. This one's fun.
Yeah, this should be a really, really fun topic. So let's dive into it. Harrison, I'm going to hand this up to you first. You mentioned that churn is a lagging indicator. We have a quote here from back from 2018 and Jeff Bezos. This is one of the quotes that you mentioned to me when we were sort of talking about how we were going to talk about churn or proactively preventing churn for this workshop. Why this quote? Why is this so impactful for you? And sort of what does this mean when it comes to retention?
I think that this quote is impactful for me because I'm pretty sure I read it when I was dealing with some churn problems. We had a churn at Driveway. And I think that there's a temptation to look back at hey, what did I do last week? What were the initiatives for this month? Where did I go wrong in terms of, this churn happening, in the last week or so? And I think, one, Jeff Bezos is known for his more long-term thinking, but I think that this does take some pressure off of teams who are under the gun for a retention metric. That is a very hard metric to move if you're just looking directly at a churn percentage or a net revenue retention metric. And the analogy that kind of inspired me sharing this quote with Stuart was, watching TV, and they talked about inflation as a lagging indicator. And if you're the Fed, you're not just looking at inflation as like the thing that you need to be controlling for. You're looking at inputs from labor markets, you're looking at inputs from production. And so I think what this shows is that, if you have a retention problem, that's maybe not a function of what happened in the last week, the last month. It's oftentimes a byproduct of some of those earliest interactions that you had with that customer. And so I thought that this was one of the big traps, or one of the big problems that teams fall into when they're trying to drive retention, is just viewing it singularly as that moment of churn and not over the course of that whole customer journey and maybe what happened to them 3-6 months ago when they first found out about your product.
You might be muted. It looked like you were saying something important.
Good call, Shareil. And that really gets into, why do customers churn? How do we find out which customers might be more likely to churn, and how do we ultimately go do something about it, right? And I think this is sort of the second really interesting thing that you brought up to me, Harrison, that I'd love to get your sort of take on a little more, is creating magic and building habits, and how those two moments, maybe folks have talked a lot about the aha moment early in their journey. How do you get more customers to experience that aha moment as early as possible? But how does that relate to retention and ultimately avoiding churn, when that's maybe at a very different stage of the life cycle in the way that many folks are looking at things?
Yes. I had originally seen this quote or this framework in an interview with the CTO of Loom. And if you think about the first time you used Loom and Driveway as a Chrome extension product as well, it wasn't like I made a Loom and then overnight, I shifted all my customer comms over to Loom. And I think that they have done a really good job of understanding that there is that magic aha moment when you're first interacting with a tool. Maybe you're interacting with a demo or just a landing page, but that moment is very, very different than that ongoing habit moment. And that habit moment can take a very long time to create. And so I think another mistake, and this is something that we've done as well, is, you might be looking at churn. Maybe you do think, hey, let's go look back at activation. We look back at activation. Activation was pretty good. We used to say activation was just creating a guide. And like, but people are signing up and making guides. What we didn't really understand at that time was that the habit moment was coming when they were actually sharing those guides with their peers. That is a whole different kind of hurdle for someone to jump through. And I think when you separate those two metrics, you start to realize that you need two very different approaches to driving these different types of moments. So whether you call it the aha moment or the magic moment, I like to think about wearing my magician hat for this. It's about surprise and delight. It's about the reveal. It's about shock and awe and suspense. And but just because you get someone over that hurdle doesn't mean that you've actually built a habit for them to adopt your product. And so, Stuart, when we were talking about this, I asked you the question. I was like, Stuart, when was the last time you created a new habit? And like, how hard was that? And how many times did it take of maybe start and go before you really built that into something that you were just doing naturally and organically? And so I think the hat that I like to think about for that habit loop is almost more of like a personal trainer or like a fitness coach. We need to talk about goals. We need to talk about timelines. We need to measure progress along the journey so that you stay motivated. These are two very, very different types of motions. I think that this is the other trap that startups tend to fall into, and it happened to us as well, where you think that just because you're getting someone to the aha, that doesn't mean that you've actually gotten them to the habit of bringing this into their world. I think the last thing I'll say on this is that, I think when people talk about the .com bubble, I think they think about vaporware They think about tools that don't really fulfill their promise. But the truth is that a lot of the products out there today are very robust, very full featured. It's just a matter of integrating those tools into people's habits. That is the limiting factor. There is so much out there right now. And so if you're not talking with customers about their goals, their timelines, and how you can actually bring that value into the organization through implementation, then you're leaving a lot on the table and probably increasing the likelihood of churn.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shareil, I know that this, I'm sure you can jump in with this thing as well. It's like from your time at Sprout, like I know we've talked about in other workshops, is what are the things that you're doing that are related to that magic moment versus the things that are then, can only happen once the magic moments happen, but have to happen in order for that habit loop to start forming. Like what are examples that you've seen that, of the power of splitting those two sort of stages out, or those two metrics out?
Yeah, I'll answer that in a sec, but I'm going to go a layer above that too. There are, or maybe below it. I don't know where this layer sits. There are two aha moments. There are the ones we internally care about, and then there are the ones customers care about. And it's best to obviously make those align. This goes back to aligned outcomes and goals, like Harrison mentioned. And I think often, especially at earlier stage companies, we have our own understanding of a product and its value, and this is so cool and all these advanced features, let's get customers there. And we get them there and they don't care because it's not actually their aha moment. It's not actually solving their problem. And so if that's the case, there is no world where a habit loop exists. They're not going to form a habit around something they don't actually care about, right? So part of it is, and this I love this slide, because part of it is that setup moment. Like, what is the understanding? What are your actual goals? What are your needs? Can I get you there? And then we talked a lot about this at Arrows too, this idea of how-to content and why-to content. The how-to is, how do I get you to that moment in time where you say, oh, that's how I do that thing. Aha, got it. Value realized, at least for once. Why is how you form that habit. Why should I keep doing this again? Why should I care about this? Why does this impact my day-to-day and my business and all those bits, right? Why does this make my life easier? And if I can teach you both of those things and show you how to get to that first value realization moment and enforce that why, now you're at least building the environment where someone can turn that into a habit and do it again and do it again and do it again. Enough of that will eventually curb churn. It won't prevent it completely, because you're still going to have new users, different tools, different cases come up inside of companies. But if you don't get to that first aha moment, and if you don't show someone how to build that habit, there's no world where you're going to retain them in the long run anyway. And I've seen that a lot at Arrows. I've seen that at Sprout Social. I've seen that at Booking. Those tools are complex. They are big. I've seen it in Driveway, working in that product, where you reach the aha moment and you get a little bit excited, but if it's not the one that's actually solving your problems, you lose some interest quickly. That is iteration. That is looking at that again. That's learning from those customers that are churning. We'll get into obviously those early life cycle moments in a bit, but this is so critical, and it's it seems like an easy step, but it's actually not an easy step. And it's really understanding what are those milestones, then figuring out, are customers hitting them, then figuring out how fast are they hitting them, and are they repeating them over and over and over again. If that's all true, sure, they are activated and likely using the product.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into so the big question that we have here is, like, how do you identify customers that might churn? How do you identify what to actually go do about that? And I know, Harrison, one thing that you have been, shared is, running a churn pre-mortem is a way to, start identifying that. So, like, how do you actually go ahead and do that? Like, how do you set about running that? What's the sort of process that you run? How do you document it? And ultimately, what do you learn by doing it?
Yes. So the pre-mortem framework comes from a pro poker player, Annie Duke. And if you're a pro poker player, you live in a world of probabilities. And I think that, it's very easy to look at a pipeline and be like, oh, this has a 60% weighted, conversion likelihood. And so we're just going to weight it that way. But the truth is that there are any number of reasons why a customer might potentially churn from your product. And it behooves a company to understand all those potential outcomes. Because what's tricky about retention is that you are trying to prevent something from happening before it really has happened. And so I think that there's a temptation to maybe just kind of export a bunch of churn reason codes and put them in a pie chart, and you take the biggest slice and you're like, okay, biggest churn reason code was budget, like let's lower prices, or maybe we're okay with that. Those level of insights aren't super actionable. And so I would balance that with some qualitative data, looking back at the early interactions with this customer. Start from the beginning. I know you can't do this for every account, but maybe there's one ICP customer that you thought, hey, this was something that we really should have kept. And I would look through their early customer journey in 3 kind of large buckets: onboarding, kind of their initial like awareness of the product; implementation, your ability to implement that product within their organization and actually deliver results there, kind of like the habit step of activation; and then lastly is their training. And so don't just look at the communications you did send them. Also think about the communications you didn't send them. Did they add team members? Were those team members trained? Did you add a new feature that might be relevant to this ICP? Did you train your key users on this feature? And so from there, you should have a map of a bunch of different problems. This can be a little bit overwhelming, but once you are done with this exercise and you have these large kind of buckets of problems, you're looking at a map of all the different probabilities that could be happening with these customers. In the end, I find this very grounding because they're the churns we expect and they're the churns that we don't expect. This is just a great way to acknowledge the fact that it's not as simple as maybe what you heard on that churn call. Oh, it was a budget thing, see ya in 6 months or whatever. Don't talk to me. Yeah, that's how I would go. That's how I would go about running a churn pre-mortem.
Budget is just, when someone says the word budget, that means you didn't deliver value. That is on you. You didn't show that aha moment soon enough. You didn't get them to solve their problem fast enough. And to your point, Harrison, churn, bad onboarding causes churn. I also think really good onboarding can cause churn. The key is to learn from it. If you're doing really, really good onboarding, you are likely resetting certain expectations. You might be digging deeper into product feature and functionality that someone didn't realize it could or can't do. And that is also okay. The key, though, from that is to learn from that churn. Hopefully there's enough of a foundation there where someone tells you, was it budget? Sure, agree. Budget is tough right now. Always empathize. And can you tell me what would have made this more valuable for you? Is there a certain feature that would have made the price make sense for you? Is it if it's truly a lower price, you can reduce your price all you want. There's still not going to be value if they don't know what the aha moment is and how they got there, right? And so I think churn is inevitable and it's going to happen. If you can catch it and learn from it, that's how you reduce it over time. That's how you can backtrack and then proactively address some of those bits and pieces, right? The most obvious one we usually see is in marketing and sales. We say something is fast to set up, easy to deploy, quick to get going. And then I show up and give you a 90-day onboarding plan, which is the opposite of those things. That's expectation setting. I can control that. Sure, I can go delete a bunch of tasks from my plan, which seems like the obvious solution. But then those tasks don't get completed and you're further from that aha moment. So the actual solution is internal collaboration and talking about, is it fast and easy to deploy, or do we need to be a little bit more realistic with that? Does it get to this aha moment in this time frame, or do we need to be more realistic with that? So it's also about just learning from that. And to your point, not every customer responds. Even at Arrows, when we have churn, I email every customer and ask for feedback. Some don't give me anything. Some go deep into it and actually share. And because I stage it as, thanks for giving it a try. I understand it didn't work out for you. I'm trying to improve this process for future customers. And if you come back, make it a better experience. Anything you can tell me is going to help me with that. And oftentimes people do give us real valuable feedback. And then from that, we try to avoid, again, those things in the future.
I really like your point around expectations and almost like onboarding being too good. Like going back to the, fitness trainer analogy, like I could imagine as someone who doesn't really invest a lot of time or energy into fitness. If I were getting pitched by a fitness instructor and they were like, Harrison, you're going to be flipping tires, you're going to be throwing ropes, you're going to be doing push-ups every day, I'd be like, this is not for me. Even if I commit to that first class or something, like my expectations, you just don't want to overwhelm your customer. And this was actually the startup I was at before, managed by Q, but it was a construction SaaS product, and big tool, sidebar with like 30 different features. I'm only going to demo like one of those features depending on who I'm talking to. Let's make this really bite-sized. Let's make this really approachable. Let's make sure that you feel like you can be successful with this. If you can't, let's talk about that. But in a situation where you're almost presenting too much optionality for people or setting the expectations too high in terms of what your tool is going to accomplish for them, don't forget that they need to be involved in that process too. So if you're saying, my tool is going to change the org, how much time are you expecting from this person? And what are you signaling to them in terms of their time commitment in order to deliver that? And like a good habit, like you can get there over time. You can start running more miles. You can add more onto your schedule, but make sure that you get that foot in the door. Make sure that you set those expectations right, and make sure that you identify that right use case for your customer to be onboarded to without throwing the whole kitchen sink at them.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have a really interesting question here, which sort of relates to this. Like, at what point are you offering a trial period to get to that aha? Like, how do you sort of design, if people need to get to this aha moment in the journey, how are you designing that experience to make sure that they get there? And one thing that I want to call out as well that Shareil, you mentioned, that I think is really interesting, is that even if you're doing onboarding really well, especially if you're doing onboarding really well, you're going to have folks churn, and those folks, most likely, if you're doing everything well, the folks who are just not a great fit for what the product can actually help you accomplish. They're the people who aren't going to be, like, the outcome that they want to get to isn't going to be reached by forming a habit around having that habit moment with your product. So I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this question. If you're thinking about designing that experience, where does it fit in it?
Not.
I think it depends on your channel and your monetization method. So I think for like a PLG product where you can kind of self-serve sign up, like that aha moment could be part of your free offering. And maybe at a later time, you're trying to monetize based on like engagement or usage with that feature. I would even say that there are some situations or sometimes when I'm reading some of Stuart's content on LinkedIn and I'm like, I'm having a magic moment right now. And so I would be open-minded about like where you can create that like that aha moment in particular. I think for us, those trials are key for establishing the habit moment. And because Driveway is a tool where you're producing training content, going back to that fitness coach, we are talking about the milestones. It's not like, hey, is there a race coming up you're preparing for? But like, hey, is there a big redesign that is coming up that you want to make sure you have your documentation, 10 out of 10 for? Let's work backwards from that. So at least for us, like that trial is really important for that habit moment. But my personal opinion is I would be open-minded about how you can create that aha moment, depending on your product, through landing pages, through marketing collateral, or through other media like that.
Yeah, the thing I'll add there too is if you are going to open up a trial, make it a trial, make it easy-ish for people to use. Don't unlock every single, and I'm not saying go block features, but don't unlock every single feature. If you have complex reporting and data analytics, I would rather get to a point where I get to my first aha moment. I have to send something, I have to create something, I have to do something to see some data. That to me is far more beneficial than opening up some demo dashboard with dummy data in it that is so far from where I am in my trial at that moment that I can't even begin to wrap my head around the value of it. Sure, it's fun. Sure, it's exciting. And reporting is a very big culprit of this because everyone wants better analytics and everyone wants better data. And we promise the ability to schedule stuff and export stuff and see all this data in real time. And the truth is you have to use a product for a while, likely, to get to that point where those reports even make any sense or there's any value in them for me. So if you are going to physically open your product up to a trial opportunity, be very clear of what those initial aha moments are. What are the dependencies to get to the big grand marketing reveals you have, and help me see those moments and make it, to your point, both of your points, make it easy for me to get there, have resources, have content, have videos, whatever it is. But give me a chance to actually leverage that trial to see that first moment. Otherwise, now you've just created a separate pipeline with a bunch of trials in there that need their own management, and they're going to have questions, and that's going to cause inbound. And if they aren't ICP, now you're also distracting your engineering teams and your marketing teams and your sales teams with potential features and feedback that actually isn't the path you wanted to go in the first place. So trials are great, just tread lightly with what you're exposing in them.
I think that's such a great point, that being very clear about what does a successful outcome of a trial look like, and especially if you have a complicated product, how do you the aha moment, and I think, Harrison, we talked about this before, like the magic moment doesn't have to be real. It's like it's where I love magic is it's a good example here. Like it can be a little, like you can do things to short circuit that loop, right? Like if you have a product that has a high bar to go set up, that you need a lot of configuration to go see data, how can you show the magic moment without having to go through all of that to get people to the point where they're like, okay, like now I'm going to go and invest some time. Now it's worth me setting up all these things that I have to configure, integrating my tool that I have to go get permission to integrate in order to take the next step, which you can't build a habit that way because they're not actually using it for real, but you can get them sort of one step further in that journey.
Shareil, I love the example of like analytics. We definitely have like an analytics tab, but it's only visible if you're a paying customer. But I think sometimes you get thrown into a tool and you go to the analytics tab and it's just like empty, and it's like, you haven't made a guide, like go make a guide. And it's like a little pedantic, it's not really tapping into the use case. And I think to the point about expectations, you're setting the expectation of like, okay, well, you need to be using this thing like every day. You need to fill up this data table. You need to, create some data, create some insights. And that's just not realistic. And that's not like how your customers are thinking about like the problems that they're trying to solve.
Right. And you're instilling in my brain that has to be true. Now, if I open that dashboard 2 months from now and I had a slow month, I'm going to think, oh, Driveway isn't valuable because there's no data in this dashboard, when that's just not the reality. I see that happen way too often, especially with analytics, where you might have a slow period and now the thing that you highlighted as the most valuable product offering isn't actually that valuable because I had slow sales or slow onboarding or other metrics that made those reports not look so great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really great question that we kind of maybe skirted by a little bit at the top of this sort of section, but how do you actually go about identifying those habit moments? If it's not coming, and same way that your churn reasons aren't necessarily going to be the best if they're coming from your sort of exit survey, how are you going about identifying habit moments? Like what data are you looking at? Like what are the inputs that you're sort of taking to get to a defined metric that ultimately you can sort of create a baseline and measure against?
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's twofold. Customers can obviously, if you're on customer calls, live with customers, if you're doing sales and onboarding, you physically hear and see that aha, the excitement, the oh cool, and that again is if you're doing good discovery and asking people what their problems are, what they're actually trying to solve, and then you quickly jump into showing that, you will see those reactions, and we capture those clips, and now you have those pieces. So the qualitative side is a little bit easier because you get that physical reaction. Quantitative gets interesting, and then it depends on, and I've worked at places where I've had access to data scientists and machine learning and data teams that can help me build health scores. And I've had versions where I'm physically clicking through HubSpot and trying to see if a customer opened a tab or didn't open a tab. Both are great. Depending on your business and your budget, you might have to go one way or the other. We were chatting about this earlier too. This opens up the topic of churn and activation and activity, right? If you have enough data and have visibility into it, what are the features customers use by volume the most? You don't know yet if they're the right ones or not, but by volume, which ones are getting clicked the most, which ones are getting opened the most? If you're tracking session times, where are people getting stuck the longest? Can that correlate to I'm trying to figure it out? Enough of that data, you can maybe pinpoint 2-3 things. And obviously this likely matches your marketing and the product you're offering and the actual solution you're after. Do you see customers doing these things? So if you are a tool like Driveway, where you are creating guides for processes, how many guides are customers creating? And is there a moment where if you hit the 10th guide, you are less likely to churn? If that's the case, maybe that's the aha moment. In Arrow's case, if you're creating templates, and is there a number of templates? If you're sharing plans, is there a number of plans shared? Then you can keep going and going and going. Is there a number of plans shared within a time frame? That kind of sets you over that. And so this is why churn intrigues me so much. You can learn so much if you reverse engineer it, and you can start to figure out that customer churned, they used none of these 3 features. We have to get people to use these 3 features. Great, step 1. Now, how often do we have to get them to use these features? At what volume? At what frequency? And there is no perfect recipe for this. There is no perfect health score. There is no perfect churn score. But directionally, you can start to get insights and learn. Customers are doing this. They made it to this point in their life cycle. They used these features X amount of times, and they happen to stick around, and they renewed, and then they grew their revenue. And all those become the answer we're looking at here. Like, how do you identify that aha moment? So yeah, to me, it's twofold. It's listening to customers really closely, and then starting to unpack whatever data you have access to, even if that's a singular data point, even if that's just opening the app, if that's session times, whatever it is, and then eventually learning and growing on that and building on that.
One thing I will add to that is like some process of like deducing your habit metric. I totally agree with like using like cohort analysis, but look at the companies that churned. Yeah. If you successfully activated them, chances are you didn't. And chances right. are you probably have that metric wrong, and now you've identified one wrong metric. I will say for us, it was a combination of, Shareil, I think you make a great point around depth of usage, but we were looking at, cohorts based on who had shared a guide, who hadn't shared a guide, who had taken this action, who had embedded a guide, who had not embedded a guide. And then you want to slice that across as many other data points, whether it's product engagement, whether it's actually monetization, don't forget that one, in order to identify like, okay, here are some kind of like leading signals of certain metrics that we can pull on in order to drive retention. I think the last bucket of like more qualitative insights or inputs that you can get is if you have people who are habitual users of your product, regardless of if they're at the perfect ICP, regardless of if they're in the perfect persona, sit down with them and talk to them and have them tell you the story of how they got to where they are with your tool. Yeah. And the amount of emotional insights that you can get in hearing someone tell that story and that narrative from their perspective is, I think, really powerful. And what I like about framing it as a story is usually a story has a turning point. And that turning point is a pretty good signal of like, and then I, started running every day, and like, there's my habit. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is just putting this question up here. I think this is a good answer to this question, even though it wasn't here before. Is like, if you don't have the data on the quantitative side, what can you gather from qualitative, interviews? Like, how do you build that narrative around the journey that the customer had? And if you do that enough times, if you run the same, you take the same type of customer and you run that interview, you'll start to identify patterns. And whether that's, if you, depending on the volume of customers, like maybe you can get this with survey data if you're able to, qualitative responses to surveys. Are there specific things that they call out that, this was the thing this was the reason that I signed up. This was the thing that I saw as the outcome of sort of implementing this. Like, how can you start to build that narrative without the quantitative data, and over time you sort of start to identify the patterns that ultimately will get you that same, like, this is an indication of a customer who has been activated, is headed in the right direction, versus one who hasn't, if they're not sort of having those similar early interactions.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add there too is I've been trying to be better at this myself, is just asking customers why. Like, when they tell you that was exciting, or that solved my problem, or that didn't solve, like, why? What were you really trying to do there, so I can learn from it? And then, if it's working, great, try to repeat that with the next few set of customers. If it doesn't work for those customers, maybe it was a one-off or unique situation. But unpacking that why, I even do this in onboarding discovery calls now, where I ask customers, why were you even looking for arrows in the first place? And it actually tells you a lot of information that then you can hopefully get them to those aha moments. And if that why doesn't match any of to your point, Harrison, you have your own internal obvious ideas for the product you're building and the space you're solving for. If that why doesn't match any of those, you might want to keep an eye on that customer or figure out, is that something we should be solving for? Because that's a aha moment that they're likely not going to reach.
Yep. And I think the person asking the question is bringing up a very valid point, which is, products are changing, macro environment's changing. Like, will we ever truly know, like, the perfect habit moment? I don't think so. Like, I think there's always room for further nuance and, like, better understanding of that metric. I think the risk is in not having a point of view on it, even if it is very uncertain. And you can, safeguard this by saying, like, I don't know, only 30% confident that this is the right habit metric for us. But I would start with some sort of, like, leap of faith assumption, because if you don't start with that, it's very hard to learn if you don't have a specific hypothesis that you're pressure testing. And I think an example for us from Managed by Q, from a services background, we looked at cross-selling products as kind of like the habit moment. Like, you've bought a core product from us. If I could upsell you or cross-sell you on 2 separate products, that's a sign that you've built a habit around using us for your office spend. So it also depends on your product offering, but I would start with, that wasn't like a super analytical answer we had. We just kind of, like, started with that assumption and then worked from there.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah. I'm curious. So one of the things that we want to, sort of get into is, how do you actually start implementing change? Like, where do you start to look in terms of, you've identified some of these moments that are maybe leading indicators of a successful versus a sort of potentially risky or at-risk type customer who might churn later in the journey. Like, what are the things that you're actually rolling out, and sort of how are you iterating in the things that you're doing to improve those early life cycle stages?
I think Shareil mentioned this around expectations, but I think it's very easy to miss the kind of soft skills training aspect of this, and the shift in mindset towards, preventing churn versus just trying to, like, create retention. And so I think expectation setting is key. I think one of my favorite tactics when I think about, I have this big lead, we're working on this product feature, it's maybe not a priority right now, but it's floating kind of somewhere in the roadmap. Every couple of weeks, send an email, hey, just letting you know, no major update, just saying hi, not much has changed. I just want to keep this communication loop with you and make sure you know and trust that whether something good or bad or otherwise is happening, that, Harrison's on top of it and you're going to hear from Harrison about it. And so I think that proactive communication is really, really key. And I think that proactive expectation setting, little things around, when your reps are telling people they're going to send an onboarding follow-up email, when are they saying they're going to send it? And, like, when do they actually send it? Just say you're going to send it, end of day tomorrow, and surprise and delight them with it in the morning. So I think soft skills training is a good opportunity to look at around that, like, onboarding and activation moment.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. Definitely set clear expectations. I think no is an answer that a lot of us shy away from because it's uncomfortable. But I think a customer would rather hear the word no, we are not going to do that, or no, we can't prioritize it today, than to sit and twiddle their thumbs and wonder if it's going to happen or not. Some tangible bits, like when I obviously learn a lot in onboarding from customers as to were expectations set correctly, did something get missold, did something get mismarketed, and part of that is just, again, reverse engineering it. When I catch some of those things one time, maybe it's a fluke. If it happens multiple times, I'll try to unpack, is there a specific, and this is not to point fingers or be passive aggressive, but is it a specific sales rep whose deals keep running into this challenge? Is it a specific marketing funnel that ends up with customers churning more constantly? And then it's going back, and the change management piece is hard. If you find one thing and you're in a big organization, everyone might not adopt it or believe it or find it's true. But if you have that one champion on the other side, which we all have, that friend or that person we work closest with, in past worlds, when I've uncovered bits like that, I always test it, to your point of like having a hypothesis, trying to test it and see if it's true. I'll go find a single sales rep or a single onboarding CSM and say, I think this feature is more valuable than we think it is. Can you bring it up in your next 10 phone calls and see what reaction you get? Or I think this feature is being oversold. Can you stop selling it this way? And let's see if those customers have a better expectation. So my whole thing is, when you catch things reactively, can you answer them proactively in the future? Zendesk and ticketing systems is a great place for that. You can unpack themes and understand questions that come up constantly in month 6. How do I proactively answer those in month 1? Better yet, how do I proactively answer them before month 1, right? And that all levels up into expectation setting. Here's what timelines look like. Here are the things we can talk about. That is how you optimize onboarding. That's how you optimize implementation. That's how you improve the sales and marketing processes, is by those little iterations on it. We talk about arrows a lot about how onboarding never ends. And I genuinely mean that. I don't think it ever actually stops. And you have to have a date where it ends, and you have to have a number of calls you're going to tell a customer that are going to happen, because they need a certain level of expectation. But internally, that should be a mantra you live by around this idea that it never ends, because you shouldn't try to jam every single thing into the first call. You shouldn't try to make someone go do a list of 20 homework items. We are obviously an onboarding plan tool. So in our onboarding plans, we have a sales process. We have a bit of we actually use this as a handoff for that expectation setting. So in here, we have a phase called Let's Make It Official. That's really sales. That's the handoff between sales and arrows. Have you paid for the thing? And do you know where to access that thing? Now that we're going to get started, great. Once those bits are done, let's actually schedule that kickoff call. Let's learn about your current process a little bit more. Are you using specific objects or ways of working? And this is all to let customers know we are getting to your aha moments. And Stuart's actually showing a real example of an onboarding plan that we use for one segment of our customers. This now probably has 20 tasks in it. At one point, it probably had 40 or 50 tasks in it. And that's because and this was like a year ago, but I was advertising, coincidentally, reporting and advanced dashboards and analytics that you can get to. And it's an imagined state and this really cool place to go. And there was a question somewhere in the chat too around, how do you do it if you don't have data, or if they're low touch and you're not engaging with customers as much? I'm very guilty of this. I can go record a 20-minute video of how to set it up, how to do it, how to start using it, and then you're going to get to this fun world. Or you can reverse that again and show the dashboard and tell people, in 6 months, this is what your dashboards could look like. That's a 2-second thing. For now, you have to create your first template and send your first plan and do your first XYZ, right? So expectation setting is so critical. The other advantage of actually documenting your process and having, whether it's arrows, a checklist, whatever you're using, you can actually pinpoint where customers are now getting stuck in that process. That is impossible to do in a string of emails or in a spreadsheet. Whereas in an actual tool for it, you can see where they're getting stuck. And if more than one customer gets stuck on that singular place, again, that is a problem that you have to solve. It's the wrong task, it's the wrong time, it's the wrong description, it's the wrong expectations, all those bits. And so if you're tweaking those little bits over and over and over again, you are constantly optimizing, you're constantly scaling, you're constantly growing that internal process. And I tell customers this all the time, and I hope all of you on this call think this way. Customers don't care about our process. They don't care that me and Stuart or have a Slack channel going back and forth about deals. They don't care if my CRM is missing notes or fields are broken in there. They just want to know what to do and is it going to get me closer to the thing that I'm paying you for, i.e. that first aha moment and the ones after that. So it sucks. It's hard. It takes a long time. Documenting is not everyone's favorite chore to do, but it's the starting point to all of this. You cannot solve churn unless you document process because you don't know why they're churning. So once you have that, then you can unpack little bits of it. Once you have that, you can give feedback internally. Once you have that, you can set the next customer up for better success and so on.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to call out sort of in a real example here that we really have, we have sales in here, then we have a lot of sort of like alignment and then setup. And then ultimately, this is probably sort of your first sending a plan is sort of the first, real aha moment. But I want to call out that this is an example. If I share, this is on our marketing site, but we also have this opportunity to have a sort of magic moment around like the problem that Arrows could solve. And obviously this is specifically Arrows, but the problem that Arrows could solve and how it solves it without you ever getting into the product, without you ever, actually setting anything up. It's sort of an example of how we can move things earlier in that journey to help explain to customers what might be possible in the future if you go ahead and make the investment in setting things up. So this is just with an interactive tool here, but not everything has to be real, but ultimately to get to the habit moment, you have to be building in, the investment. You have to be getting people through all those steps that they need to be set up and have everything they need to keep using the product. So we sort of jumped a little bit to tools. We have a couple of questions here in the chat. How would you also apply, the changes, the improvements you're looking to make in your company to reduce churn when it comes to sort of people and process as well? I know, Shareil, you always talk about process and the importance of process. Harrison Kelly run a tool that helps you document and educate folks on process. But how do you sort of actually go ahead implementing things there? And then what does the people piece mean, which I think often sort of to the point about soft skills often gets not neglected, but is maybe an afterthought after spending some budget on a new shiny tool and documenting a process.
I think my bet is if you got the 5 people at your company who are closest to retention and activation, and you put them in a room and you said, all right, everyone draw a picture or draw a diagram of like what good looks like for activation. I'm very, very confident you will get 5 different pictures and 5 different answers. And so I think this is a little bit of process, but also a little bit of people. You may need to convince people that there is this activation problem, and it is often a cross-functional problem. And so I would start with aligning a group around like, what does good look like? And once you have that, it's a lot easier to work backwards, or as Shareil would say, reverse engineer. But oftentimes people think they are in sync or on the same page about what good looks like, and you're actually not. And that's where a lot of like your ongoing work tension can come up. So I think that is like a good way to basically engage a group and make sure that you can get that buy-in up front, not just have like one exec who's signed off on your initiative and then you're running into something with marketing and they're like, wait, what are you talking about? We have this email that we send on the first day and people open it and it's amazing. Like we don't have an activation problem. So I'd start with getting a really good understanding of like what good looks like, and don't be afraid to bring data, bring a perspective to that conversation in terms of what you think that looks like for your customers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that it's always a cross-departmental collaboration problem. You said often. That is the core of it. It's people not realizing, you nailed it, like it's people not realizing these problems exist, or that there is an activation problem, or that we've labeled it a churn problem, but it's actually an onboarding problem and an implementation problem. And so part of that is just talking internally and actually exposing those. The other thing I love doing is making our executive leaders sit through those programs and through those processes. Make your C-suite folks sit through a full onboarding live with customers. Let them hear, let them see where people are getting stuck. That opens a door, that opens people's eyes, especially if you're working with more tenured people at a company. They are just in their ways, and they are, I did this at a prior company where we were working with the chief design officer and going through onboarding. And he pulled me aside afterwards and thanked me and was like, I honestly haven't been into that settings page in 5 years since we built it. And I didn't realize that in the depths of that was a poorly designed permission setting. And from that, once we kind of had that establishment, and I think part of this is being able to prove it's working and show the data and all that, right? Good onboarding is hopefully reducing churn and increasing retention and expanding revenue. So if you can tie whatever it is you're doing to the biggest business metric there is, which is usually revenue and customer satisfaction, and then prove that by doing some of these small things, it is, even if it's not improving, but it's directionally heading in that way, at least you have a table, and then get the right people around that table to have a meaningful conversation about it. And that takes time. That doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to go and obviously change the entire way a business operates. But I've done that in past worlds, and within a couple of years, I was sitting between all the department heads and having a conversation, all stemmed from onboarding, but the topic was how do we retain customers and how do we drive more revenue? And so with enough focus on it and enough feedback and enough trying to create that place where you can give feedback to each other, I think you can foster an environment where most people will care about it, and most people will want to listen, and most people will want to try to help solve. Again, if you're also showing value internally. Why do I care to give feedback to the sales teams? Because I also want them to sell better deals and hit their commissions and not have to do this back and forth dance with Slack about what is going on here. I would rather our marketing team not spend time trying to figure out who the ICP customer is and just tell them this is what it looks like, or let's talk about what it looks like. So internally, same with support, post. I don't want you to spend hours answering the same question over and over and over again when I could have proactively addressed it in training or in onboarding. So that cross-departmental collaboration, I think, is so critical to figuring any of this out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a question they sort of put up for a moment there. Like, is there, in your mind, is there an ultimate sort of owner of, the habit moment of retention? I know this is going to depend on your org structure, on who shouts loudest maybe in the exec meeting, but ultimately, where does that responsibility sit?
Harrison. It's all on Harrison.
Trick question, I know.
I was actually really excited to hear what Shareil would say. I think it's like an amazing question. And I think that, my co-founder, Chris, and I, we roughly split responsibilities by customer success and account management. And this may be controversial, but there can be trade-offs in appointing singular ownership to initiatives or metrics. It is not always the best for your most complex problems. And so I don't think I have a very good answer, but I do think it is kind of like a shared responsibility between Chris and I right now across CS and account management. I think product is also an interesting owner for it. But again, all this stuff is very cross-functional. I think a lot of the traps that we talked about, just looking at retention as a metric or just looking at activation as a singular metric, comes down to kind of like oversimplifying what is like a very complex human process. So I don't know, Shareil, I don't know if you have a more direct answer than what I do.
I do, and because I've lived this world, I think the owner is the person who's most annoyed by the frustrations that come from lack of that process, and someone eventually picks that up. Usually it's forced upon some sort of leader or executive on the team. But over time, if it's annoying one individual enough, and this is quite frankly how I've built my own career over the years of being the person that takes some of those hypotheses and shows them to our leaders and says, this is what I'm thinking, here's what I'm seeing. If you follow like the DAISY model of project management, where there's actually a driver on something, and then you have approvers and contributors and people that are informed, once you get that group together, sure, you can have an owner per topic, but ultimately, I actually agree with your answer. It is across multiple people. Each people have to own their part into that. I think you need a defined goal if you're putting together this sort of community or guild or whatever you want to call it internally. There has to be some defined goal that you're working towards. And then from there, you can branch out those individual owners or the people that care about it. And sometimes that does lead, and in my past world, that's led to a dedicated role where I've gotten to sit in that role because I played the part of owner. And then that role's responsibility was basically to project manage everyone around me and all the other department heads. So I became the owner, but it really was owned by 5 or 6 people who each then distributed work to their teams and to their respective departments. So yeah, if your org is smaller, I mean, usually it's someone higher at the top. They are kind of owning everything and then collaborating and delegating. If you're in a larger org, especially if you're in like a customer success or even sales or marketing role, and you're trying to build your career and grow your career and have some more ownership of those side projects, something like this is very powerful, because if you're actually solving, or let me not say solving, if you're moving the needle towards those business metrics, someone is going to care. Someone is going to listen to you. Even if they don't listen in that moment, eventually they will listen, because what we're talking about is everyone's problem at the end of the day, which is customers leaving your business, which means revenue is leaving your business. And we all see what happens when that's the case. So I don't know if that's a roundabout answer too or not, but when I've been in that situation, I'm like, fine, I'll own this, because quite frankly, I'm annoyed of dealing with customers turning, or I'm annoyed with this bad deal coming over, or with this bad onboarding process, to put some onus on myself too. So I'll take some of that ownership. And to Harrison's point from earlier, you're not going to solve everything. Pick a singular hypothesis, pick a singular thing you want to test, see if that thing proves true or false. Most A/B testing, you're not going to see huge variances in sort of answers in there. You're going to lean a little bit to positive, a little bit to negative. Most things end up kind of neutral. For the neutral ones, don't waste people's time. Find one of those things where you see something positive, something negative, and then build on that. Talk to a counterpart, talk to a person on your team, see if they're willing to try it. I guarantee if there's enough legs underneath it, and if there's solving towards some sort of problem, somebody will listen at your company. I guess I shouldn't guarantee, but I would hope that someone at your company listens if you are presenting that type of information to anybody.
Yeah, I'm going to go with hopefully a not particularly controversial, but maybe controversial owner of the problem, and that the CEO should absolutely care about retention and churn. Churn will kill the business 100% of the time if you have enough of it. So maybe that's a good place to close things out. Thank you everybody so much for joining. If you have questions, we've hopefully answered the vast majority of the ones that we had in the chat. If you have more questions, feel free to shoot us emails. I'm Stuart at arrows.to. We have Shareil at arrows.to, and Harrison at driveway.app. Feel free to reach out to us. Harrison, thank you so much for being here. A quick plug for Driveway, folks who are looking for an education sort of product walkthrough tool. Tell us a little bit about Driveway.
Yes. I think going back to our points around finding opportunities to experiment with your customer activation, candidly, we started out as a tool for training and onboarding your employees. And what we're seeing is that a lot of organizational attention is shifting towards training and onboarding your customers. What we have seen is that a lot of those products are pretty expensive, kind of cumbersome. And so we are releasing a deal for startups to help them with their customer onboarding and activation. You can find that deal on our website. We just see that a lot of, I talk with the VP of sales, we're talking about training their salespeople. Conversation ends up shifting to, hey, how can we experiment with making sure that our customers find value in the product, get activated on these key features so that we can set them up for success in the long run. And just thank you so much for having me. This is a really fun conversation.
Yeah, of course. And if you use HubSpot and you're looking for a tool to improve onboarding at sort of the account level, if you have things you need customers to do to get them up and going, and you want to spend more time with Shareil, of course, at Arrows, over to arrows.to, and check that out as well. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Shareil, for being here as always. We will send out the recording and all the take-home resources for this session as well. But everybody enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and the rest of your week. Thanks so much, everybody.